The Korean DMZ conflict, also referred to as the Second Korean War by some, was a series of low-level armed clashes between North Korean forces and the forces of South Korea and the United States, largely occurring between 1966 and 1969 at the Korean DMZ, although other inter-Korean incidents between have occurred thereafter. Background: the Korean War had devastated both North and South Korea, and while neither side renounced its claims to reunify Korea under their control, neither side was in a position to force reunification. In September 1956, the U.S. Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff Admiral Radford indicated within the U.S. government that the U.S. military intention was to introduce atomic weapons into Korea, which was agreed to by the U.S. National Security Council and President Eisenhower. However, paragraph 13 of the Korean Armistice Agreement mandated that both sides should not introduce new types of weapons into Korea, so preventing the introduction of nuclear weapons and missiles. The U.S. decided to unilaterally abrogate paragraph 13, breaking the Armistice Agreement, despite concerns by United Nations allies. At the 21st of June 1957 meeting of the Military Armistice Commission, the U.S. informed the North Korean representatives that the UN command no longer considered itself bound by paragraph 13 of the armistice. In January 1958, nuclear-armed Honest John missiles and 280mm atomic cannons were deployed to South Korea. A year later, adding nuclear-armed Matador cruise missiles with the range to reach China and the Soviet Union. North Korea denounced the abrogation of paragraph 13 as an attempt to wreck the armistice agreement and turn Korea into a U.S. atomic warfare zone. North Korea responded militarily by digging massive underground fortifications resistant to nuclear attack, and forward deployment of its conventional forces so that the use of nuclear weapons against it would endanger South Korean and U.S. forces as well. In 1963, North Korea asked the Soviet Union for help in developing nuclear weapons, but was refused. China later, after its nuclear tests, similarly rejected North Korean requests for help with developing nuclear weapons. In North Korea, the departure of the People's Liberation Army in October 1958 allowed Kim Il-sung to consolidate his power base and embark on the Chollime movement of collectivized agriculture and industrialization to build a base for reunifying Korea by force. North Korea remained dependent on the Soviet Union for technology and on China for agricultural assistance. The Sino-Soviet split led to the Soviets suspending aid to North Korea in December 1962, saying that the DPRK was leaning too much towards China. Following the war, South Korea remained one of the poorest countries in the world for over a decade. In 1960, its gross domestic product per capita was $79, lower than most Latin American and some sub-Saharan African countries. The April Revolution that forced President Syngman Rhee from office in April 1960 was followed by a brief period of democracy before a coup d'état, led by General Park Chung-hee, seized power in May 1961. Despite the political turmoil, the South Korean economy continued to grow, led by the industrial sector. Rapid industrial growth started in the late 1960s, with gross domestic product per capita rising from $100 in 1964 to $1,000 in 1977. Without Soviet support, a conventional attack by the North on the South was impossible, and so Kim Il-sung saw a possibility to achieve reunification through unconventional warfare. On 10 December 1962, Kim proposed a new military strategy to the Central Committee of the Workers' Party of Korea, with increased emphasis placed on irregular warfare, agitation and propaganda, to be achieved by the end of the current 7-year plan in 1967. In June 1965, President Park signed a treaty normalizing relations with Japan, which included payment of reparations and the making of soft loans from Japan and led to increased trade and investment between South Korea and Japan. In July 1966, South Korea and the United States signed a Status of Forces agreement establishing a more equal relationship between the two countries. With its growing economic strength and the security guarantee of the United States, the threat of a conventional invasion from the north seemed increasingly remote. Following the escalation of the Vietnam War with the deployment of ground combat troops in March 1965, South Korea sent the Capital Division and the 2nd Marine Brigade to South Vietnam in September 1965, followed by the White Horse Division in September 1966. The start of the hostilities can be traced to a speech given by North Korean leader Kim Il-sung on 5 October 1966. At the Workers' Party of Korea conference, where the status quo of the 1953 armistice agreement was challenged. Kim Il-sung apparently perceived that the division of effort by the South Korean military and the ever-growing escalation of the U.S. commitment in Vietnam created an environment where irregular warfare could succeed in a way conventional warfare could not. Kim believed that he could force a split between the U.S. and South Korea through armed provocations targeting U.S. forces that, together with other worldwide commitments and small wars, would force the U.S. to reassess or relinquish its commitment to South Korea, allowing North Korea to incite an insurgency in the South that would topple the Park administration. There were ongoing propaganda campaigns between the North and South, such as loudspeaker broadcasts across the DMZ at each other. Leafleting of North Korea had been resumed, such as Operation Jilly from 1964 to 1968, which delivered a few hundred million leaflets into the North military forces. North Korea in 1966, the Korean People's Army deployed 8 infantry divisions along the DMZ, backed by 8 more infantry divisions, 3 motorized infantry divisions, a tank division and a collection of separate infantry and tank brigades and regiments. While strong, this conventional force did not possess a significant advantage over the South, and it was unlikely that the North could deliver a knockout blow before the U.S. could deploy additional forces. The main unconventional warfare arm was the Reconnaissance Bureau of the Ministry of Defense under the operational control of the Liaison Department of the Workers' Party of Korea, which included the 17th Foot Reconnaissance Brigade and the All-Officer Unit 124 and 283rd Army units. These units were all highly trained and indoctrinated, skilled in demolitions and small unit tactics. They would usually operate in small teams of 2 to 12 men, lightly armed with either PPS submachine guns or AK-47s. The Reconnaissance Bureau also controlled the 23D Amphibious Brigade, which used specially made infiltration boats to operate along the South Korean coastline. The Reconnaissance Bureau could also use conventional KPA and Korean People's Navy forces to support the infiltration and exfiltration of its teams. In addition to the offensive irregular forces, North Korea also deployed several thousand operator agitators to select, train, and supervise informants and guerrilla recruits, while others attempted to cause individual defections and unit dissatisfaction in the ROK military and generally undermine the morale of both the ROKs and the Americans. United States and Republic of Korea. The major U.S. ground combat units in Korea were the 2nd Infantry Division and 7th Infantry Division, 1st Corps and 8th Army. 2ID stood with the 3rd Brigade manning 29.8 kilometers of the Korean demilitarized zone essentially due north of Seoul on either side of Panmunjom, with another 9 Republic of Korea Army divisions manning the remaining 212.8 kilometers of the DMZ. All U.S. and ROKA forces were under the unified operational control of United Nations Command General Charles H. Bonner Steele III. Both U.S. Army divisions were seriously under strength as Vietnam had priority for manpower and equipment. Troops were equipped with M14 rifles rather than M16s. The only available tanks were older gasoline-powered M48A2Cs, and there were a total of only 12 UH-1 Huey helicopters in South Korea, seriously restricting the ability to hunt and engage infiltrators. Troops were generally draftees serving a 13-month tour, while experienced officers and NCOs preferred service in Vietnam to Korea. The ROK divisions were well-trained and highly motivated, with many of the officers and NCOs veterans of the Korean War. But all their equipment dated back to that war. The standard rifle was still the M1 Garand. The main operational objective of the US and ROK divisions was to defend against a conventional invasion from North Korea in a repeat of the attack of June 1950. While there were regular infiltrations into the South for intelligence gathering, unconventional warfare was not seen as a particular threat, and the troops were not generally trained or equipped for this role. No counter-guerrilla units or village militias existed in South Korea in 1966, and infiltrators were variously hunted by the ROK Army, Police and the Korean Central Intelligence Agency with no unified control. In 1976, in now declassified meeting minutes, U.S. Deputy Secretary of Defense William Clements told Henry Kissinger that there had been 200 raids or incursions into North Korea from the South, though not by the U.S. military. Details of only a few of these incursions have become public, including raids by South Korean forces in 1967 that had sabotaged about 50 North Korean facilities. The ground forces were supported by fighter bombers of the USAF 314th Air Division and by the Republic of Korea Air Force. The seas around Korea were under the control of the United States 7th Fleet and the Republic of Korea Navy. As with the Army, the war in Vietnam was the main focus of the USAF and the USN in the Pacific. Defense strategies. From October 1964, the North Koreans increased the infiltration of intelligence gatherers and propagandists into the South. By October 1966, more than 30 South Korean soldiers and at least 10 civilians had been killed in clashes with North Korean infiltrators. However, no similar clashes had taken place along the US-controlled section of the DMZ. In October 1966, South Korea staged a retaliatory attack without seeking the approval of General Bonesteel, causing tension between the U.S. command, which wished to avoid violations of the armistice, and the South Koreans, who were suffering ongoing losses. Following the first KPA attack on U.S. forces in November 1966, General Bonesteel formed a working group to analyze the North Korean strategy and develop a counter-strategy to defeat it. Finding the existing U.S. Army tactical doctrines to be inapplicable to the situation they were facing, the working group developed its own doctrine to meet its operational needs. 3 types of operations were identified. First, to guard against infiltration across the DMZ. Second was a similar naval effort along the coasts. And third was counter-guerrilla operations in the interior. All 3 types of operations had to be accomplished without jeopardizing the conventional defense of South Korea or escalating the conflict from low intensity to a full war. Demilitarized zones. Starting in 1967, the UN command developed a layered defense of the DMZ. The armistice restricted fortification within the DMZ, where defenses were limited to patrols and observation posts without heavy weapons. More aggressive patrolling of the DMZ was ordered, with patrols going out for 24 hours, reconnoitering by day and establishing ambushes at night. Most U.S. casualties occurred during these patrols. The observation posts were fortified with sandbags and machine guns, and recoilless rifles were frequently kept hidden there in breach of the armistice. General Bonesteel obtained $30 million in funding from the U.S. Army Combat Development Command to create a DMZ test barrier along the portion of the DMZ occupied by the 2ID and the Roker 21st Infantry Division, beyond the southern boundary or south tape of the DMZ. No defensive restrictions applied, and a combined U.S.-Korean engineer force constructed an in-depth barrier comprising of 3 meters tall chain-link fence, topped by triple strands of concertina wire and reinforced by interwoven saplings and steel engineer pickets. Behind it, a narrow, raked sand path paralleled the fence to highlight footprints. Behind the sand strip was a 120 meters wide cleared kill zone in which mines and tanglefoot wire fronted a line of conventional defensive positions of interlocking machine guns and pre-registered mortar and artillery fire which dominated the kill zone. Observation towers stood at intervals along the trace to permit clear view of the open areas. Various electronics and sensors were tested on the barrier similar to the McNamara line in Vietnam, but with the exception of starlight scopes they were largely ineffective. The barrier could not prevent infiltration, rather it was intended to slow movement and provide easy observation. Behind the barrier were the quick reaction forces of mechanized infantry, tanks and armored cavalry that would hunt down infiltrators. The rules of engagement were also loosened to allow the frontline troops to use artillery and mortar fire against known KPA elements in or south of the DMZ and against KPA firing from north of the military demarcation line, although in practice this was only used sparingly. A new 4-monthly rotation scheme was introduced in October 1967 to ensure that each battalion received only its fair share of time manning in patrolling the barrier. 7ID sent 1 infantry battalion at a time to augment the 3rd Brigade, 2ID. This increased the defense to 4 battalions on the line plus the quick reaction forces. South Korea launched at least 3 retaliatory cross-border raids in late 1967 using small teams of North Korean defectors. The raids killed 33 KPA soldiers. Korean coastline preventing infiltration at sea created an impossible challenge for the UN command, which lacked suitable aircraft, ships, radar and communications. The ROK Navy possessed only 72 vessels to patrol over 7,000 kilometers of rugged coastline. Along the coasts, some 20,000 unarmed coast watches, sometimes supplemented by Roker reservists, patrolled the beaches, and when signs of landings were discovered these would be reported to the national police and quick reaction forces would be deployed. Poor communications and a lack of helicopters meant that the quick reaction forces seldom arrived in time before the infiltrators dispersed in the Korean hinterland. Counterinsurgency operations during 1966 and into 1967, there was no coordinated counterinsurgency plan in South Korea. Infiltrations were dealt with on an ad hoc basis by the Roker, National Police, Army counterintelligence units and the KCIA, usually depending on the estimate of the threat and whichever units happened to be nearby. President Park was reluctant to raise and arm a civilian militia as he did not fully trust the loyalty of the populace to his government. General Bonesteel regarded counterinsurgency as entirely an internal responsibility for the South Korean government, and while he provided some material support including his helicopters and several Special Forces A-teams from the 1st Special Forces Group on Okinawa to train the Roker and the newly formed Combat Police in counterinsurgency tactics, he declined to take responsibility for counterinsurgency operations. By late 1967 it was clear that the North Koreans were attempting to develop a full-scale insurgency in the south with strongholds in the Taebaek Mountains and around Jirisan Mountain. President Park, in consultation with General Bonesteel, developed a counterinsurgency strategy in the form of Presidential Instruction No. 18. The instruction established a national coordinating council with clear chains of command for all classes of incidents ranging from individual agent sightings to province-level unrest. 8 new ROCA counter-infiltration battalions were to be formed, together with further expansion of the combat police.